Hi, this is Paul, and I have a friend of mine today on the channel, Rudy Gonzalez. I've known Rudy. He is well, I'll let him tell his own story, but he's a colleague of mine in the Christian Reformed Church. And I'm not exactly sure what pieces, when you work for the Christian Reformed Church denomination, often these days you work like a certain percentage and there's a local percentage and it's all kind of a mess. So we'll get into all that. But I actually know Rudy more as a colleague, and I don't really know his whole story. And so I'm really anxious to give him a chance to tell his story, and then we'll get into some of the work he does. He came to my church and did an anti-racism training, and he promised me that he eliminated racism from the community. And I said, that's great. Next week we do poverty. And but Rudy, thank you so much to be willing to come on and have this conversation with me.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay. Well, let's begin at the beginning. Tell me about when and where you grew up and what the faith life was like of the home you grew up in.
I grew up in South Texas, 20 miles furthest point in Texas. It's called the Rio Grande Valley. The border town there was Brownsville, and it was the very last city before you crossed into Mexico from the tip of Texas. And it was a very segregated city. Very few Mexican-American people got to live in the better neighborhoods. Most the rest of us, we lived in what we called colonias. And I actually grew up in the projects, but it was not quite like Chicago projects, but it was a smaller little housing area that I grew up in, and yeah, it was pretty segregated. I don't remember I guess the interactions that we had with people not in our neighborhoods were in common places. So we didn't have the segregation in the pools like some African Americans had to live with. We actually got to go to the pools. We didn't see a lot of white children there. The skating rink was another place that we got to mingle with people that were not part of our community. In terms of, it was very family oriented. So Catholic church, even if you didn't have a strong faith, you were still that was part of the community, being part of the community, and then being part of the fair. The Catholics had a fair every year, and bingo and all that. My mom was at the bingo. I happened to have a little bit more, I'm not sure why or how, but I actually attended catechism in the Catholic Church, and I got involved with the altar boy. So I was an altar boy. Woke up early in the morning. I think it was like 4:30, 5 o'clock for a 6:30 mass. So I did that for a long time. Yeah. Now it was a tight community.
Now colonias is a really interesting word. Was this, I don't know how much you know about this community. Was this quite an old historic community? Was it when I worked in the Dominican Republic, they'd have these, basically what they'd call them, invasions, where a bunch of people, for some reason, everybody figured out that, if we go up into this land right now, and if we put a house on it, in 15, 20 years, we'll maybe be able to get legal deed to this land. It was sort of a way that a lot of poor people would sort of get some land. What was this community like? Was it historic? Was it new? Were the people coming over the border? Had they been there even before, the Anglos came? Because of course, I mean, American history is very complicated, but what was this community like? What was it? What were its roots?
I really do not know that. I was doing some research on something else and trying to figure that out, but I didn't get. I haven't gotten to the how it started. But I could tell you that it was developed, and what I mean by that is that there were streets. They were not all paved when I grew up, but they were streets. There was most neighborhoods when I first got there, they had light, but didn't have plumbing. But the city eventually came through and did the plumbing for that. Yeah, but the streets across the freeway, they had been paved up quite a bit, and light and everything was working on that side of the street. But on our side of the street, there were several colonias, and those colonias weren't that much different in terms of their development, their infrastructure development.
So you went to, did your parents go to mass regularly, or was your Catholic participation more social than necessarily Sunday oriented? Although you were an altar boy, so.
Yeah. I would say that it was even though they participated regularly, like Sundays, that and there's a little bit of a merging of indigenous tradition, I would say. So it wasn't quite Santeria like other cultures, but there was this just to play it safe, we're gonna we're gonna go practice some of that. I didn't do that, but I know my mom did, and I remember one time we went down to Mexico, and she visited this gentleman who said he was a chief, and he had peyote juice. So as kids, we drank peyote juice. So part of the reason why I'm the way I am is maybe because I drank peyote juice. and he would put something in the fire. I think it was sage, and then take feathers, and so we did that. But also Sunday, and then if any tent evangelist came through, she would go to those. So she kind of was very she explored all these different faiths. My grandmother was a little bit more Christ-centered, so she was into scripture. She read scripture daily, but my mom was a little bit all over the map till her later years. In her later years, she just kind of settled in to her Christian faith.
Okay. Did you have extended family on both sides of the border?
Yes,
Okay.
I still do. I have a half brothers and nephews and nieces in Mexico still.
Okay.
Yeah, and I visit there every now and then.
Close to the border or in other places in Mexico?
Close. Well, I'd say the furthest ones out from the border are probably about maybe a 2-3 hour drive. I have family in Monterrey, Mexico, and yeah, all throughout there, little towns around Monterrey.
What was your father's presence like in your family growing up?
That was kind of a weird thing because my mother was was part of the Bracero program. Okay, so because she was part of the Bracero program, later on she was able to get documented. Okay, and then as she got documented, then her and my father met, and second marriage for my mom, second marriage for my dad. And so he lived in Mexico and my mom lived here. And so we were born here. But when it came time to get him documented so he could come live with us, he stayed with us on temporary visas. But he was, they found a spot on his lung. And so he was deemed to be a liability and did not get his documents. And eventually that kind of got in the way, and him and my mom divorced. Yeah. So I'd say he was with us probably till I was in my 5th, 6th grade. And then slowly but surely they kind of went their separate ways. And my dad actually got sicker, and he passed away when I was 15.
Oh my.
Yeah.
How do you think his absence affected you growing up?
I think it did have an impact on me. Uh, I thought it was going to be a worse impact because I thought, growing up, uh, I thought, what kind of a dad am I going to be if I didn't have a dad present with me? But I think the opposite took place.
Hmm.
So at least that's what I hear from my kids, except for one right now. Yeah, but I've been I actually had to be the dad, if you will, in my family.
So where were you in the birth order?
I was the first one.
Okay, so you're the oldest.
Yeah, my second in my mom's second marriage.
Okay.
So I took on a lot of responsibility. I started my first job, full-time job, when I was in the 6th grade.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was that? What were you doing?
I was a dishwasher at a drive-in restaurant, so you could do both.
Yeah.
You could walk in and sit down, or you drive in and they'd come out and take your order, bring your food to you.
Did you get to keep the money, or was it for the household?
I always I think part of our culture was that the money goes to the household. So it wasn't like going in, there was no like fighting about, hey, this is my money or your money.
Right.
But I always got, I always said, hey, Mom, I'm going to need some money for this. So I took the money and then I gave her the rest. But it was just understood that that was part of the reason why I'm thinking that Mexican families had a lot of kids is because there was an agricultural kind of work. And so they contributed to the household, kids up. And it just so happened that when I was smaller, we were out in the fields working. And then they passed a law. So my younger brothers didn't get to work in the field like I did. Hey, that's not fair. Yeah.
How old are you, Rudy? My guess is you're about my age. I'm 57, but.
Oh, well, thank you. No, I'm 64.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Wow.
64.
Wow. You look good. You got hair.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me about school growing up. Where was the school? Was it mostly kids like you? Was it mixed? What was that like?
It was mixed. It was mixed, but after junior high, there was a system of segregation. Nope, it wasn't published anywhere, but the assumption was you're a poor Mexican kid, you came from this area, we're gonna put you in the vocational track. And so that we hardly ever, I don't think I remember any white kids in the vocational track. I was bored stiff in that track. So basically, I don't think I even finished 9th grade.
Really?
Yeah, I dropped out, and then I went and took a test because I wanted to go in the Air Force. And I had a job then too. I was a pest control person in the 9th grade. So I took a test, a GED test, and I don't know if the recruiter paid somebody off or I actually passed the test, but I got in the Air Force with a GED, and then after that, I began to take college courses when I was in the Air Force.
Okay, where were you stationed in the Air Force?
Little Rock Air Force Base, Arkansas.
Okay, and what was that transition like for you going, because it sounded like you were very much part of a community. Most of the kids around you in your cohort were like you, had similar backgrounds, similar situation. And then I would imagine the transition to the Air Force was different. It was probably quite a bit more mixed.
It was very mixed, and part of it was that I made a commitment to myself that I was not going to stay in that neighborhood. So I had kind of prepared myself. I don't know how or why, but just thank the Lord, I guess. Part of my my thinking, is I could see that that if I stayed, I was going to have some challenges that were going to be hard to overcome. Like even a job at a grocery store, which is not a big job. It was difficult to get into those positions. So I said, forget it. I'm getting out of here. So I thought, if I go into the Air Force, then I won't get stuck in this rut. In my thinking, I was thinking that, right? I was already getting involved with my friends were all doing smoking pot. One of them was a dealer. So, I really got into that. I was drinking heavily. So I really was looking a way to escape some of that. It was my own doing, but I didn't want to be part of it. So I went into the Air Force, and that part actually got worse. So I had to the alcohol, the marijuana. I'm thinking in the Air Force they shouldn't do this, but it actually got worse. So, but leaving, I think I was more homesick for my faith in Christ, because even though I was a Catholic, I remember just having a relationship with God that I had walked away from when I walked away from the church, and I had walked away from the church way before I left. I think I walked away from the church when I was about 13 or 14, and I walked away from the church because the catechism I received and the practice of the church did not quite align. And at that young age, I was kind of like, hey, it's either true or it's not true. So I just walked away. And then, so when I'm in the Air Force, missing home, missing everything else, what I missed the most was being part of that faith community and having that relationship with Christ.
So what did you do? So I could understand that. Well, let me go back a little bit. We'll get to the Christian formation in a little bit.
Yeah.
But so you, and I know for many, the military for a young man offers them sort of a reset. You can get maybe, and this has been true in the African American community for a long time. You can get out of your community, and if there's drugs, if there's, if in this community men are struggling to launch well, and they get trapped in black markets like drugs or bad habits like basically dissipation. I mean, the military offers them, and obviously, I mean, there's going to be pot and drinking in the military too, but it at least gives them a change of context by which they can change the path of their life. What about some who didn't take that path? What happened to some of them?
Well, one of my closest friends ended up in prison. And I think he did probably about 5 or 6 years, then came out, and then great for him. He ended up starting a contracting business. So he did well after that. Another one also got in trouble a little bit, and then ended up doing some kind of wholesaling with cars. So they go back and forth across the border, older cars. Although now the laws have changed, so he can't do that anymore. So I'm not sure what he's doing, but I'm sure he'll figure it out. There was maybe one or two that I think I ran into. One in the Air Force, and he actually got into big trouble in Germany. So he ended up in prison, killed a guy. Yeah. So, but other people did well too. I have a couple friends who, they were not quite in where I grew up, but not that far, a little closer to the better parts of town. And they, and they had good parents that had a vision for education. So they ended up being doctors, attorneys, and such. Yeah.
What's that community like today?
I've been back there probably about 5 years ago, and the strange thing is that the good parts are still good, right? They're still like this coming together. Hey, even though I've been gone forever, it's like I've never left, and I go back.
Wow.
Yeah. So a lot of Sundays after church gathering. The practice is you go by barbacoa, which is made from the calf's head, and you sit around the table, and it's not like, hey, we're having breakfast. People are just talking and kind of, just eating and carrying on till about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then everybody goes home. But yeah, it's a very social community. A lot of events. Yeah.
Well, let's switch now to the faith formation. So you went into the Air Force, and you're looking for a reset, but you left the church when you were 13. What happened with that? Did you meet somebody, or did you start getting involved in something? What was that transition like for you?
I prayed. I prayed a lot while I was drunk.
I'll tell you, when I was a security guard at Calvin College, I had some very interesting interchanges with guilty drunk students. It was always rather, because you drinking, you sort of lose those inhibitions, and sort of what's deep in the heart wells up. So
So I just began praying a lot while I was drunk, and back then they used to have coffee shops, Jesus coffee shops. So I went in and went in a few times, and just the guy leading the coffee shop. Anyway, it didn't do anything for me, but I kept searching. I remember searching, and then one time I was at a McDonald's. My roommate, Panamanian, so we were talking in Spanish. And this lady notices that we're talking in Spanish, and she interrupts us, white lady. She says, "Hey, my daughter is married to a Panamanian." So then we started talking, and then that was the end of that conversation. A few weeks later, I'm at the Airmen's Club, we having a few beers and playing pool and such. And this lady is there. She's leading a Bible study in this place. And so she invites me over, and just kind of having a conversation. She then invites me over to another Bible study at her house, and her husband. I went with my roommate, and all I can tell you is when I walked through that door, I felt God's anointing and saying, "Hey, you're welcome home." They hadn't done anything. I just sensed that, and then we were going through the Bible study and did that, and then at the end, the couple prayed with me, and I had sensed that, hey, I'm home now, so I just prayed with them, and it was a sinner's prayer. Hey, I repent and I accept you into my heart, and then nothing happened. I went home, and did what I normally did. I think I smoked a joint, or I forget what I did. But anyway, I went into the bathroom, and I was getting ready for the next day because I was a kind of a weekend partier. Through the week, I was straight. Anyway, I went to go take a shower, and that it was a different kind of anointing. It was an anointing of, hey, this is not what you think it is. This is there's a change in your life. You're face to face with me. I was kind of sensing God saying that to me. And right there, I just prayed for the longest time, probably about an hour and a half. Prayed, and the next day, uh, I was just totally not the same person I was before, and scared all my friends. They thought I had a mental breakdown. Anyway, they just like flies just took off. So all my friends, it took them a while to come back, but yeah, eventually they realized that it was me, but I had this faith, a renewed faith in God, in Christ. Yeah.
So how did you start going to church then? What church did you go to? What did that look like?
Yeah, I went to well, that couple took me to a church, and it was a crazy experience. It was an Assembly of God church. Here, I was a Catholic, right? So I went to
Yeah.
Assembly of God church out in the sticks, right? So
This is in Arkansas?
Arkansas, and it was at night too. This couple was white, and most of the church was white. So I'm there, and I don't know exactly what took place, but the pastor called me up to the front. And he says, hey, this young man accepted the Lord, and so we got to call him up here and pray for him. And I was up there with an older gentleman. He was called up as well. He had been put on hospice because they told him they couldn't do anything more. I don't know if they had hospice, but they said, you're going to die from cancer. He had throat cancer really, really bad. So they called us both up, and nobody warned me what was going to take place next, but I thought the pastor was going to pray for me. But man, when they prayed, it was like crazy chaos, right? Ah! So I was there. I just closed my eyes and started praying. I was a little nervous at first because that was kind of a strange experience coming from a Catholic church. And before I knew it, I was, even though I could hear everybody, I could see myself on this like giant stump. I'm not sure why. I still haven't figured out why I had that, but I could see myself on this giant stump, and all around me were people with backpacks, and they were leaning up against each other to give themselves back support. And I was preaching, it seemed like, but I couldn't remember. I couldn't tell you what I was telling him now, but I could tell that I was preaching. And then without any warning, I didn't collapse. I like a stick. I fell forward, and I hit my head on the stage.
They didn't catch you?
No.
Oh, what's wrong with these people?
They caught the old guy. He fell back. People were back there. But I hit myself on that might be another reason why I'm crazy. I heard the big thump, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't hurt. And I was there for a little bit. And then all of a sudden I just came back up, and I went back and sat down, and they carried on. But that was, after that I began attending church on a regular basis, and almost immediately, I guess, I started hanging around with this other guy, a Mennonite, who was very interested in Calvinism. Yeah, it's crazy.
You were raised Catholic. You have this vision at an Assemblies of God church. You start hanging around with a Mennonite who's interested in Calvinism.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. Anyway, we would, he and I, somehow he got involved with the campus crusades. So at 10 o'clock at night, I think it was on Fridays or Saturdays, we would go out into the streets of Little Rock, Arkansas, and we would go up and down the strip and try to talk to the prostitutes, the Johns, whoever was out there, drug dealers, and we were more, we had to be careful, not for our own safety, but for the safety of the people we were talking to. So, because sometimes they would, they'd get in trouble. But that worked really well for a while. And then we got into, visiting the jail. So the sheriff in the county somehow got a hold of us, and we ended up going to the county jail, not that far. And I did that until I left, and I also began working with the chaplain with their youth program, and being on their council. I forget what they called it. It's some kind of a chaplain council that they had.
With the Air Force, Air Force chaplain.
Yeah, I wasn't a chaplain, but I sat on some kind of a council. I was only like in my 20s back then.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So how long were you in the Air Force?
I was in the Air Force 6 years active, 3 years reserve, and then 2 years inactive.
Okay. So you left Little Rock, and where'd you go then?
I came to California because I wanted to go to Fuller. The chaplain friend of mine was a big influence in my life, Cecil. He ended up becoming the chief of chaplains. And so he influenced me and said, hey, check out Fuller. So I came to California to go to Fuller, but I had a family and they were hungry. So I went to work instead.
Let's back up and catch up on the wife and the kids at some point. They deserve a little attention in the story.
Yeah. So I got married in Arkansas. My wife was visiting her sister who had a baby, and then we started dating.
Where'd you meet her?
I met her at that Bible study, but I wasn't interested in her at that time. Just as we engaged in Bible study, I became interested in her, and then we started dating. We automatically, after I started dating, I didn't want to date because I didn't want to fall back into my old ways of doing things. So I asked permission actually back then because I wasn't sure. Like, hey, I'm a crazy
permission
guy.
Of whom?
Of the older people that were part of the. Hey, is it okay to date this young lady? And yeah, I was because I was not sure that I could maintain my purity and faith, and so I did ask, and they said, sure, you can. So, but I just told her, I said, hey, I'm interested in dating only because I do want to get married. Okay. And so at 19 we got married.
Wow. Married young.
Yeah.
And she was a Christian too. You met her at the Bible study.
Yep.
And so
Vicky. Yeah. My wife's name is Vicky.
Vicky. Okay.
Yeah.
And when did the kids start coming?
We waited a little bit because I was, even though I was a Christian, and I still had some rough edges. So basically I said, we should probably work through our marriage first. So we waited about 3 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 4 years. Yeah. And so Rita came around in 1990.
Okay.
Yeah. Rita, she was our firstborn there in Arkansas. And that was the only child we had until we came out to California.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you had a lot of wisdom. I mean, you understood yourself. You had a deep Christian conviction, and you said, well, you had a lot of wisdom in terms of you wanted to manage yourself in a way so that you wouldn't fall into these traps, and you really wanted to do things the right way. And it sounds like you really succeeded.
Yeah. Well, I can only look back and say, God has blessed my life.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So you moved to California, and so what was Fuller like for you? The Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena.
I never attended.
I
I never attended until way later, but I didn't go to Fuller Seminary.
You
What
moved to
happened?
California to go to Fuller, but you never went
What
because you had a
happened was,
family, you had to work.
that's right. I started working, and I did look into Fuller. They had a really nice program that I really wanted to get into. It was a merging of a master's and a doctorate work together. That integrated faith and psychology.
Okay.
So I was thinking about it, but then I started working at Rockwell, and because I had a technical degree, I was able to get into Rockwell.
You got that
And
degree when you were in the Air Force?
yeah, well, I started it in the Air Force and got about 75% complete, and then finished it when I came out. So I got my bachelor's in 1980, and I'm sorry, 1983. Yeah, 1980 is when I came out of the Air Force. And then I, because of that, I was able to get into a technical work, and I worked as an industrial engineer at Rockwell International for 13 years. Yeah.
When you moved to California, what kind of a church did you look for, and what was your church life like then? Now as a married person.
Yeah. So that was a little bit of a. So when I was in Arkansas, I went to a white church because there wasn't any Latino churches at that time there, right? So coming to California, I'm thinking maybe I should check out a Latino church, right? A Hispanic church. And I go there, and I was like, my wife doesn't speak Spanish. I speak Spanish, but if I have to speak it all the time, I'm going to come up short, right? And then what happens is my kids, because we were in Arkansas, well, my kid, and then my wife doesn't speak Spanish. Now she speaks more, but so it was like if you didn't, I fit better in a white church at that point than I did because they were like, hey, shame on you, because you should know Spanish, or, and I do, but then my wife doesn't. And then I didn't want anybody shaming my kids.
Yeah.
So I said, forget you. I'm going. So I went to
What kind of Hispanic churches were these? Were these mostly immigrant churches? Was the services in Spanish? Were they bilingual?
No, they were at that time, most of them were Spanish.
But they were evangelical churches.
There were Assembly of God is the ones that I visited. Where I really did fit in was Foursquare Church, which was predominantly white, but also very, there was a lot of families like myself, second, third generation Latinos. There was African Americans. So there was a good fit for us. And yeah. I mean, almost immediately, like maybe a year in, it was a church about 400 or 500 people. I was in my 20s, and they put me on the church council. So it's like, whoa! But I fit in. I fit into that church really well.
Yeah. So you're on the council. You're working at Rockwell. You're putting your life together. You've got a marriage. You've got a family. Kids. Mm-hmm. More kids start to come along. What's the next big transition that
happened?
Because I know where you are now, and so I'm really curious how this whole thing goes. But I want to take our time with it because I don't want to miss any interesting turns.
Yeah. So it worked. I still had that bug in my head, about the segregation. That stayed a little bit in my head.
Talk to me about that. So you didn't marry a woman who grew up like you did.
No.
Your children now are in some ways third culture.
Yep.
Because you grew up in one culture, your wife grew up in another culture, and now your children are in California, which is itself a third culture in some ways.
Yep.
So what did you mean by that segregation comment? I'm curious.
So let me see if I can make sense of it. Have you read the book Hillbillyology?
Yes, yes.
So I had I really identified with it because I had that in my head about I'm not like them, right? And because I'm not like them, I have to work super hard.
Not like them in terms of the people you grew up with.
The people I'm working with
Oh, the people you're working with in California?
at Rockwell,
At
right?
Rockwell, okay.
Okay, so it's all in here,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're not saying, hey, you're not. In fact, they did get in trouble, and they were sued, and they were really working hard to make sure that there was people in leadership positions and high paying positions that were African American, Latino. They were into diversity. They were forced into it, not that they had to do it. But so they were doing everything that they could, but still in my head, I still had and I'm thinking it's like the hillbillyology. It's this idea that because I'm not them, I have to work twice as hard to make sure that they know that I'm just as good as them.
Mm.
Right? And because of that, I did well. I did well. I got pushed up the ladder fast. But I think the healthier part there is that if there were differences, like if somebody wanted to how would I put it, size me up, if you will, to say, hey, you're, and they would say that in the Air Force and at Rockwell, they make some kind of comment about I'm not like them, right? Because they were white, but it was not the same. I did not take it the same as where I grew up. It was more like a jabbing kind of thing, and so I was able to jab back and be able to say, hey, success, I'm doing well, better than you are, if you will. Yeah. So I'm going to jump a bit, but I did not get that in the church. In the church, I could not do that. I could not do the jabbing back and say that. So my which I think forced me into a good direction, that I had to face that thinking in my head, face it, right, and look to be healed from it, or to continue to seek healing from that, because I mean, it's there, but that's sanctification.
Yeah.
So it became part of my sanctifying process.
Now you knew you couldn't do this in the church because you understood that, in a sense, in the workplace, it's a little bit more, but in the church, this is the kingdom of love, and so you're not going to attack your brothers and sisters in Christ. It's a very diverse group, so you're now suddenly going to have to say, all right, so there's probably there's surely some racism on the other side of the fence with these people seeing me. Whether or not I'm seeing it clearly or not, that's a pretty safe thing to assume. But I have to ask myself, what's on my side of the fence? And I have to deal with myself.
Yeah.
That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh.
So in the church, I couldn't deal with it. At least my perception was that I couldn't deal with it, because my attempts to deal with it resulted in people getting offended, and people taking offense. My first example, I'll give you that, is when I first came into the denomination, people would ask me, what country did you immigrate from?
Which denomination? The Christian Reformed Church?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to go back there, but keep going.
Yeah. Anyway, so they would ask me, what country did you immigrate from? So after a while, I just thought I'd do a smart comeback, right? And
Texas.
I said I immigrated from the Texas, and I could see the lady's face turn bright red. So I knew that I had stepped on a landmine there, or I had offended her. But I figured, hey, you're assuming I'm a person that I'm not. Yeah. So
Well, let's. So you're going to the Foursquare Church.
Yep.
You're working through this stuff. What's your next? But you didn't get to go to Fuller, but you're on the church council at Foursquare.
Hmm.
You probably having you give messages at some point too, or you're taking a more and more active role in the church. Where's the? I mean, what's the next pivot here?
After 13 years at Rockwell, I got laid off. Jimmy
Oh,
Carter came in and did away with our military programs and world peace. So people like me were out on the streets. And then I remembered I came here to go to Fuller Seminary. So I was also a Gideon.
oh,
So at one of the Gideon meetings, we had a professor from Azusa, and I shared, because they said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for work, but it's not going to be that easy because there's a bunch of us engineers out on the street." He says, "Well, I think it was Pew or Lilly, one of those, gave him a grant to reach out to people like me, and so he said, well, why don't you consider Azusa?" So I looked at it, and they ended up paying half of my tuition. So I know Fuller, they didn't have anything at the time. So I ended up going to to Azusa, but I did not, you had different tracks. So you could go more on the theological track. I chose not to go the theological track. I chose to go more on the ministry, practical ministry track. They were started as a layman's institute, so they were strong in that area. So I ended up going through that. And then my theological training, I've taken it on my own, attending seminars, conferences, things like that. But I've always had that kind of leaning towards Calvinism. Yeah.
oh, I mean, you had this Mennonite friend that's into. Talk to me about this Calvinism bit. What's with that?
Well, he actually, I think he actually took me through Burkhoff way back when.
Okay.
And then, so I was, the bigger piece is because I was Catholic, it made more sense to me than all this other dispensational stuff
Yeah.
that I was hearing. So in terms of the end times, scripture made more sense to me from a reform perspective than the dispensational perspective. And then as I read the scriptures, Romans especially, predestination, it just kind of, I couldn't completely grasp it initially, and I still kind of, how far do you take it? But that's where I ended up being leaning in, and that's why I was attracted to the CRC. One other person was a chaplain. He was a Assembly of God, but he was also very much into Calvinism.
Okay. Now you're taking some courses at Azusa Pacific. You're no longer at Rockwell. Is your next stop a paying ministry gig? What was that? How did that happen?
My next job was whatever I could find. So I had an old pickup, and I was cleaning out yards. And then a buddy of mine said, "Hey, there's a window job." So I went to Sears and bought a bunch of tools. I think I spent $1,000 in tools. And for the next year and a half, I was putting in windows and doors. And I had to, part of my work with Azusa required that I have a mentor. And the mentor that I had, the only mentor I could find that would qualify for mentoring with me was a CRC person. He was doing a church plant at Redlands.
Who was that?
Joe Almaraz. I don't know if you remember him.
No, I don't know.
Anyway, he ended up, he was a crazy guy, but anyway, I think when I went to him, there was 25 people. He was doing a church start, and stuck with him, and he got into building and other things. And I said, okay, look, I told you I was going to be here for 6 months. I was there a year. So then I left him. He had about 200 people. And then I went to another CRC pastor, Gilbert, I forget his name. He was also planting a church. But then the whole CRC URC thing came up. Anyway, before I go to the next church, Joe told me, hey, they're hiring for what is now World Renew. Back then it was called World Relief, Christian Reform World Relief, CRWRC, right? So they're hiring, but I looked at the date and it had already passed. So he said, apply anyway. You never know about these things. So I applied, and they had, I didn't know this, but they had already interviewed all the applicants and they didn't like any of them. So then they reopened it after I sent mine, and I made it, and then they finally hired me.
What did you do for World Renew?
I worked with congregations to engage more in parish ministry.
Oh, interesting.
So integrate community development and into the congregational ministry. So rather than say, hey, we're going to do a food ministry or we're going to do some kind of jobs program, we would say, as a congregation, take a look at your community, at your neighborhood, and work with other churches, other agencies in your community, and baseline where you're at now and where you want to go. Develop a shared ministry vision. So that's what I did. And through that, yeah, several groups. We ended up going first with congregations, and then moving to intermediary groups that would then work with congregations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So similar, for those who are watching and are not familiar with the Christian Reformed Church, used to be the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee was a relief and increasingly development, really a sort of a diaconal agency of the Christian Reformed Church. I worked with them in the Dominican Republic. We had World Missions, which was church planting and development, Christian education. And then we had World Relief, and that's been recently renamed World Renew to avoid confusion with another organization called World Relief, which was diaconal. And so, for example, in the Dominican Republic, I worked with a good friend of mine, Casper Geistifer, who was doing that type of work. And in the Dominican Republic, for example, they started something called DESCO, which was to be a diaconal arm of the Christian Reformed Church in the Dominican Republic. It did small business, a bunch of little projects. Yep. We also worked with non-CRC organizations. There was one in the Dominican Republic, Casa Caribeña, which was developing greeting cards and basically cottage industry in the Dominican Republic that could be sold in the developed world. And so there are all these different things. And so sometimes because relief is there's a disaster response is one aspect, but another part is community development. How can you engage in a struggling community and help them develop small business, organize themselves, all these different kinds of things. So that's just right. Little background for the audience, because I don't want us to just use all this CRC nomenclature and have nobody understand what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So you were doing. So I'm really curious. How did that work go? And because I know, also what's interesting. Maybe we could talk about this a little bit. Also, the history of the Christian Reformed Church in California, and especially Southern California. In the Christian Reformed Church, there were different waves of immigration. One wave was before the First World War, And most of those people settled in New Jersey, Western Michigan, Iowa, and a few other places in the United States. After the Second World War, there was another wave of Dutch immigration that landed people often in Canada and in California. So the California migration was a little bit different. And I grew up in New Jersey, obviously, spent time in Western Michigan, the Dominican Republic, and then came to California, and I could see, here in California, I could again find people with, at least in the late 1990s, people with Dutch accents. And so the California, there was a heavy emphasis on dairy, and in Southern California, they built dairies in Bellflower, and then moved out to Chino, Inland Empire, and then some have moved up to Visalia and other places. So, the Dutch CRC landscape in California is a little bit different than other places in the Christian Reformed Church in the Midwest and in the Central Plains. Talk to me about what that world renewed, that development work was like. What did you find in the churches, and what were some of your impressions of the churches these CRC churches that you started dealing with?
Well, I think the first 3 years, I don't know whose decision it was, but I was to work with church plants by Latino pastors.
Oh.
So I really found that they did not have the capacity to do the level of work that was needed. But it took a little bit to kind of start, stop. But one of the work, so we did do some work, for example, with Min Lee in Little Saigon. We did some work training, income tax preparing, and
something immigrants need.
Yeah. So we probably had about 50, I'm thinking, 50 people trained to do that and do it as a business. So they got licensed with the state and all that. We got into some trouble because the guy that was doing the training, he has to be certified by the state to do the training. So he showed us documentation, but we didn't know that he was certified to do tax preparing, but not the training. So after everybody completes the class and we charged, they all get rejected, right?
Oh, no.
So I thought that was my first project. So I thought I was gonna get fired, right? So I talked to Andy, and we got some funding, and
Andy Rice-Camp?
Andy Rice-Camp, and then we got money to pay another association who then reviewed all the materials and everything else and certified that it was good training, and then they were able to pay the class. But we had to pay them $5,000, so that was like, oh no. So we did that, and then we tried to start some businesses with them. Didn't work with men, but what did work is we did after school programs, and Anaheim Church, Anaheim CRC sent ESL teachers over. Really a good number of people came from Anaheim CRC. So we were able to do that. And as far as I know, they're still very, very involved in doing ESL and homework clubs and things like that. So that was one thing. With the Hmong Church in Riverside, we tried to start and we did a farm project where we did those plants that they put out on the gas stations that color, they have seasons. So we did that. In our learning, we started the plants and we killed half of them and still made money. But what I did was I said, let's see if we can do a partnership with the Cal State, not Cal State, the Baptist University here in town. They had a professor there who was wanting to partner, and we were going to buy some property. But but the pastor there wanted more to do a church, not the garden. So we had to back off of that. But they eventually did some growing herbs, the Vietnamese herbs, and a few of them were able to then start a little business and sell to the restaurants, things like that with them. Out in Sun Valley, we were able to develop a collaborative relationship with Calvin College and a small college, and then do kind of a cradle to university plan, working with low-income kids, bringing them into daycare, and then try to work with families, helping their kids develop a vision for education, getting into education. So we did also a lot of ESL, after-school programs, things like that. And then we had quite a few. I'm thinking it was like maybe around 15 to 17 students going through college that weren't college bound before, and they're still around. So we developed a nonprofit there. I think we didn't do one with men, but we did one with the Hmong groups. So that was like kind of early on. In the meantime, we lost a lot of the church plant folks. They were really trying to do the work, but bivocational, the denomination was not really as invested as they should have been to launch that work, because a lot of these people were trying to make a living and trying to start a church, and there wasn't enough support for that. So most of those churches ended up dying. We moved from there more towards parachurch group works. So we ended up working with Job Starts in LA, did some savings program with another big church there in LA. I forget the name right now. But a lot of trying to increase wealth with poor folks, and then do individual development account matching. And then also alongside of that, I began working with a big Assembly of God church. I found that if I worked with folks outside of the CRC, and then I was able to bring them into the CRC and have that there was a little bit of more of a paradigm shift, because they were seeing that things could work differently from what they had been trying, because other folks were doing it, and then they were able to have success. So Templo Calvario, I still work with them. They do a lot of work in community, housing, economic development. They have a school of 300 kids in Santa Ana. They work with the school district. It's not outside. It's not a private school. It's part of the school district work. And they also do parenting classes. So a lot of good work. At some point I brought in Terry Larson, who began the Kingdom Works. It began evolving. They did work out at Long Beach, working with the city. Then I think Terry and another lady from Fuller ended up doing a city's work kind of thing, and they carried on. I did some work also with a group in a Baptist group. They really had a lot of work on how to educate people for healthcare, for a lot of little things. And this guy would document everything. Harvard educated, so he was really, really good and detailed. So worked with him. Tried to do some work in Texas, and it went a little bit, but not that much. And then by then I got laid off because CRWRC wanted to launch Communities First. And I was noticing that the closer the development work is to the community, the easier it is to fund. So at the intermediary level, I was having trouble finding funding for the intermediary groups. So I thought, if we go to the national level, it's going to be an uphill. And so I decided that I'd rather get laid off than try to go push that rock up that hill.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, funding wise anyway.
Let's talk a little bit. Where were you worshiping in Christian Reformed churches at this point? What were your impressions of? And obviously, you were not only, I mean, you were also working with CRC pastors, CRC deacons, I would imagine. Tell me about some of those experiences.
Well, my experience, I'll tell you about my experience with deacons.
Okay.
So coming in, nobody had done any, well, there was two sides to that coin. So with deacons, there was a like, don't try to redo diaconal, what do they call them? Conferences.
Oh yeah,
Don't
diaconal
go there.
conferences.
They already told me don't go there. And they being Andy and others saying we have them all over the place, and there's some are effective and some are not as effective.
Yeah, they're sort of like CRC chapels.
Yeah.
On the church side.
Yeah. So I said, okay. So, but I did a seminar on diaconal training, right? I did 2 of them. And even though I was reformed in my thinking and my perspective, I was still also very evangelical. Okay. So in my mind, proclaiming the gospel, telling people about Jesus that's where my accent was, and less on transformation of community, justice, those kinds of work. Although it was there, the accent was more on. So when I got together with deacons, part of my thinking was, how do deacons reach out to the poor with a message of salvation? That was not the whole message, but that was part. So that kind of like threw them off a little bit. But I found that the deacons have the heart for both, for evangelism and for justice, but they don't have the space. At least then, and I think still now, there's no space for a Stephen, or very little space. In most of the churches I've been to, for a Stephen who can take charge and go and preach in the streets, if you will, there is no room for that within that. And I think that's where the prophetic call of deacons is to that level of leadership, to be prophetic in the community, but also be prophetic in the church, to come back to the pastors, elders, and say, hey, we're missing the boat here, right? There is not, I don't see that happening. I see more leadership coming from pastors and elders at the expense of creating space for the call that God has placed on deacons, and the fulfilling the ordination of deacons.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if with deacons you're running into some of what you ran into with bivocational pastors, because a deacon in a church, well, first of all, they've got their day job because they're lay people. They've got their family life, which part of the movement of the last 50 years in a whole variety of churches, basically culture is, well, don't sacrifice family life don't sacrifice family life on the altar of your other. So you've got your job, you've got your family life, you've got your church life, and then as a deacon, it's almost now a fourth thing. And part of what the church wants from deacons is, okay, you're going to take the collection, you're going to count the money, you're going to manage the business of the church. If you're going to add another component, which is all of this other work in the community, I mean, you're a ways down the priority hierarchy, especially with the typical candidate for deacon that we've seen in many, especially the Dutch immigrant CR churches, which are deacon is sort of the, you've got your wife, you've got your degree, you've got your job, you've got 1 or 2 kids. Now it's time for you to be a deacon. And then maybe after those kids are in high school or so, then you're going to be an elder. And so, I mean, in some ways, the way deacons have worked in the CRC, that's
That's what I'm saying, though. I'm saying that there is no call, or the call is not honored for a deacon. Because if you say the deacon is called first to be a deacon, and then when he demonstrates capacity and responsibility and does that well, then we're going to make him an elder.
right.
I think that really doesn't, why ordain then? If you're really talking about ordination and the person is going to steward that call, it has a lot more to do with giving direction, giving leadership, not just doing, but being that, living into that call. Yeah, because if you live into that call, that means that at some point you're going to have to call in the pastors and the elders and say, hey, we ain't doing what the scripture is talking about here. We're going to have to change the direction and be able to say it. I mean, like Acts, right? Chapter, what is that? Chapter 6.
Feeding the widows.
Yeah.
And you know, the book of Acts, it's a very interesting transition because, you know, the problem is the Greek speaking widows. And, you know, one of the interesting things of the book of Acts there is that you really can you can see the seam. It isn't highlighted in the book, but you can see the seam between the diaspora Jews who have resettled in Jerusalem.
Yep.
And of course, Paul, Stephen, all of the deacons named there have Greek names.
Right.
And so, but then obviously very quickly, these deacons, you know, and part of, I mean, this gets into CRC history and the history of ecclesiology in the CRC, because, you know, you're exactly right in that in many ways in the Christian Reformed Church, deacons were elders in training.
Yeah.
And that became the tradition within the immigrant churches. And so the rites of passage in the CRC was you're baptized as an infant, you make profession of faith as a teenager, you become a deacon in your 20s or 30s, you become an elder in your 40s or 50s. Clergy are on a different track, of course, because they're much more of an academic track, and they're sort of called to be scholar in residence. So, I mean, and all of this tradition is in some ways inherited from the Netherlands. And then, of course, when it comes to the United States, you know, refitted and jiggered. And so, and then, of course, when you have other, like, I mean, I love your story, and I'm so glad that, you know, we've had this time to talk about this, because you very much, I mean, your story is so, your story is so American in terms of, you know, I mean, it just in so many, I mean, you've just been all over the map in this, and all kinds of different ways. So, so what are you doing now? Now you're in Moreno Valley. Well, talk to me about, well, I don't know how many more jumps there are in this trend, but I much better understand, you know, coming in World Renew, emphasis on deacons. Here's another question for you with the Hispanic church plants.
Yeah.
Because I know, you know, having known, what's so interesting to me is that these different traditions attempt to, let's say we have all of these needs that get manifest, all these elements basically to have the whole range of the gospel. There's proclamation of the word, there's deed. in many Hispanic traditions that I've seen, the diaconate comes through the pastor, because in almost a patron sense of the word, that if there, and this was true in the Dominican Republic, it was true in the Haitian churches, I've seen it true in Assemblies of God, Hispanic churches in the United States, where in that sense, the pastor is sort of he's sort of the boss on top. And if there's a family that gets in trouble in the church financially, you call the pastor, and it's the pastor that helps them out. The pastor will there's a kid in trouble, come into my house and you'll live with me for a while. And I'll not only give you a bed and I'll give you some food, but I'm also going to disciple you. And that's very different from this Dutch tradition, where you, in a sense, have this Kuyperian sphere sovereignty, where, well, the pastor's over here, and the pastor's, he's going to be a scholar, and he's going to sort of be the academic in the church, and then the deacons have their sphere here, and the elders have their sphere here. And so when you get into a multicultural setting, and when the Christian Reformed Church attempts to diversify beyond its Dutch immigrant roots, all of these streams begin to come into conflict, because now, generations after immigration, you have a CRC minister who may or may not have a Dutch last name, and there may or may not be much left of that tradition, but you've got mainline influence, you've got evangelical influence, and now you've got more of the social justice influences. So, there are so many streams coming together that for a church to begin to think about this systemically and instantiate it, this is a very dynamic environment we're dealing with.
Right. I would say that that's one of the reasons why sometimes I push back on assimilation, because assimilation assumes that the group coming in will adapt to the group that's already here, and I think part of the problem has been that the African Americans coming into the CRC have really looked to assimilate into that, and it hasn't worked for them. And I think because of that, we have less African Americans. I think that Latinos, as well, as they're coming in, their context is different, right? Now, you mentioned the practice of Dutch pastors being the academics. I think that's predominantly true, but there's also been some cases where they came in through informal training, and they had to be out there helping with setting up the pens for cattle and barns, and so I think that as there has to be some adaptation in the CRC if we're going to continue to do the intent of church, of what the CRC church envisions, because we have great documents in terms of that. But I think the practice has to change a bit. And I'm thinking that even the call of a pastor to be an academic, I think that, and maybe another word to use that, maybe the professionalizing of the call should be evaluated, looked at, because as a pastor, you're called to lead both the elder and the deacon in that call, right? So there has to be a little bit of a diaconal, a prophetic call in the pastor's life, as well as being the elder. So I think that for me, that would be the difference between the elder and the pastor, that he is called as a pastor of the church, which includes both the prophetic call of deacons and the shepherding call of elders.
What what do you think? I mean, it was very interesting the way you phrased it in terms of the CRC, because I think actually we're seeing this in the RCA right now, as the RCA is, very pretty much disintegrating and just coming apart.
Yeah.
I think in many ways the real question for the CRC is, what is it for?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got, a lot of people don't recognize, so you've got the mainline influence now. Mainline American church history is so complex, and your story, your story relates this well, because if you were to gather a group of 100 CRC people in a room, select them randomly, even just from churches in Southern California, and ask them, what does it mean for a church to be Christian Reformed? Boy, I really don't know the answers we would hear. Now, you've gone into a lot of churches, and because of the kinds of training that you've done, you have had a chance to hear a lot of people. Now, I think there is in some ways a vision that comes out of, I mean, you mentioned there's stuff written on paper. The Christian Reformed Church is very good at putting things on paper.
Yep.
That comes out of the academic training of its clergy, because academic people put things on paper.
Yep.
So I'd be curious to hear more of what you think. Now, you're in Moreno Valley, and you have a credential as a commissioned pastor currently.
Yep.
And I know Moreno Valley, Al Breams, was the church planter there. And Al was a very energetic pastor. He started the evangelist training program, which sort of became a template for the leadership development networks. And so, I've dabbled in that, because I've dabbled in lots of things over the years. And you're in Moreno Valley, and of course, Al Breams, is he still there, or did he leave the community entirely?
As far as I know, he's teaching.
Okay.
He's still ordained because he does some chaplaincy work. Okay.
But I know that Moreno Valley, I think in some ways Moreno Valley, every church is unique, but Moreno Valley has within it the elements of so many of the different strands and strains of the CRC in Southern California.
Well, I would say that Moreno Valley is probably one of the more diverse cities in the Inland Empire. So Al had a very diverse church here. I'd say like Chino Hills is a little harder. It's going to be maybe a little bit more Anglo-Asian. And then Redlands has pockets, but I think where the Redlands church is at is a little bit more Anglo than it is. I think that they may have a few families at their church, but not like Oasis, not like our church. Even though our church right now, because of COVID, we're like, I don't know what's going to happen, but we're a smaller group now than we were before.
Yeah. I'm in the same COVID boat. That's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. Maybe you ought to start a YouTube channel, Rudy. That's what I'm banking on right now.
Yeah. We have one friend of ours who has been doing it pre-COVID, and he's got like 2,000 or 3,000 followers. So we were saying, well, okay, that sounds good, but don't come to us and ask us to help you start a church plant then. Yeah.
Well, talk to me a little bit about your so anti-racism in the CRC. That isn't located in World Renew. How did you
No.
get in, or what's the history of that? Because of course my father was very involved with SCORE, the Timothy Christian fight. I had a conversation with a guy from Chicago. Tell me a little bit about this and how you got involved with this.
So part of my work with community a big part of that is economic injustice, right? And usually economic injustice is usually racial injustice, racial economic injustice. So when I did a lot of work while with that group. I did a lot of work with a group called Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. Okay, so we worked against the logistics industry, who hired a lot of Latinos and African Americans, and what they did over a 10-year period was reduce what used to be a good living, forklift drivers. That used to be a good living, and they really brought it down to almost a minimum wage level. And so we worked with them, we worked with unions, and that was part of our work there with them. So when I got laid off from CRWRC, Esteban Lugo, working with race relations, approached me because I really had set up quite a few groups to do their work on their own. And that's why he hired me, because he said, I don't want you leading events here. I want you to create leadership to carry the work on. So then I came in for that reason.
Well, that's very interesting, because that is very much a World Renew model. Because
Mm-hmm.
World Renew, what they really want to do often is, as they did in the Dominican Republic, start DESCO, and DESCO can then continue the work, because obviously if World Renew is always doing the work directly, you're always going to be doing the work. But if you can start other non-for-profit organizations, non-government organizations to do the work of development, let's say in the communities where there are Christian Reformed churches in the Dominican Republic, you can yourself leave and go start that someplace else. It's a rather entrepreneurial model, actually. Tell me some of the things you've learned doing this work.
Well, I think I've learned a lot about what I was telling you about that thinking in my own brain first, right? I didn't realize how bad it was until I stood up in front of a whole bunch of pastors in the Christian Reformed Church at what we call the classes meetings, and they're all white, and it does something to my head every time I get up there and it's all white. It's like, whoa. And so I really have to learn how to calm that down. Got me into trauma healing, learning about trauma healing and all that. So getting into that a little bit more and more. Resonate is going to be doing some work with that in the future. But also that part of the problem I'm thinking we have in the Christian Reformed Church is that the work of anti-racism or race relations has been pulled out of the gospel, the work of the mission of the church, and I'm not sure how we can make a way for it to be more integrated. Because if it's an add-on, it's really difficult. The same thing with the diaconal work. When I was doing the diaconal work, the more it seemed like an add-on, the more it was like too much work, right? But if it's part of our DNA, part of what we do, I think that then that is it does. We don't have to be reaching out to people. People are coming to us. We don't have to convince anybody. We're educating ourselves. We're becoming more aware of our own biases that we have. We're becoming more aware of kind of the conditioning that has taken place over our nation's history. And then we don't get as we don't get fragile in terms of guilt. We can kind of look at it and understand it and then work through that. So that's what I've kind of been learning. But also sharing stories, people sharing their own story, good and bad, and trying to help create space for not dismissing stories, but keeping them together. Sometimes I'll give you an example. We did some work in Gallup, right? We did the blanket exercise there. And part of that exercise says, hey, there was injustice done to Native Americans by taking them off the reservation, sending them to boarding schools. And so we went through that. The pushback we got from the relatives of the folks that ran the boarding schools was, hey, but my parent wasn't like that, or my grandparent or my uncle. But that wasn't the issue at all. The issue is that because of the conditioning, the way we look at other people, then we treat them in a way that is below the dignity of being a person created in the image of God. So if we can understand that and being able to share, yeah, my parents were missionaries. They had a good call on their life and they did this. And then be able to share the other side of the coin that says, yeah, but the impact was this, and then come out with, but God is sovereign, and this is what we can see now, something like that.
Mm-hmm. What how much part of where, I mean, in many ways, my father, I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. My father was called by so in New Jersey in the 50s, you began to have the Dutch immigrants had moved into Paterson. Paterson has, in many ways, you can think of Paterson itself as a port, even though Paterson's not a port, because immigrants came into Paterson, and as they, they'd get jobs, they'd save a little bit of money, they'd get better housing, and they'd tend to move out to, more, other communities, so on and so forth. The East is very different in that quite a bit more ghettoized than the West. We get some of that in the West, but it's not like the East. And so the Dutch folks who had lived, Prospect Park used to be called Dutch Hill. It was 90%, a little 1 square mile town just outside of Paterson. It was 90% Dutch immigrant, and, filled with Christian Reformed churches. And then people during the post-war years began to buy in Wyckoff and Midland Park, and some of these other places continued to grow. And then first the people moved out and the churches kind of stayed in the city. And then eventually some of them would rebuild their churches more in the suburbs and sell their church or something. And then there were during, obviously, World War I sort of clamped down. I don't know if you've ever read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns.
No, but I talked to Reggie this morning and he recommended that one.
Oh, I did a funeral for the mother of a member of my church, and I was reading this book at the time, and her story in Southern California fit so well with the California element of this. If you want to understand the roots of the experience of African Americans in cities outside of the Jim Crow South, this is a wonderful book. So my father is called to so basically the CRC people have been leaving and no immigrants from Europe are coming. And so folks are, black folks are leaving the Jim Crow South because of Jim Crow, and they're getting good jobs in Chicago, in the New York metropolitan area. They're coming out to California. So they're basically moving out into the rest of the United States from the traditional slave states. And some of the very kind-hearted, well-meaning folks, who's actually quite a few widows, they're moved out to the suburbs. They saw the poverty, what was going on in Patterson. And so they started Northside Chapel, which was sort of a sandwich and gospel mission. And then they call my father, who's fresh out of seminary, and thinking back on it, he probably never even saw, the only black folks I would imagine him seeing growing up where he did in farming communities in the Midwest were probably Pullman train porters. So he goes to Patterson, and then eventually, of course, the civil rights movement comes. That, of course, deeply impacts the church, which is mostly black. There are always some white folks. So Northside Chapel, where I grew up, you know Sheila, I'm sure. It was an alternative for both groups. It was an alternative for the black community because there are plenty of black churches around. Many of the buildings that CRC people left to build new buildings in the suburbs, these became inhabited by black churches. And so this process continues and continues. And then, of course, the Christian Reformed Church has to sort of begin to figure out, well, what does the gospel mean? What does the gospel mean in a context like this? And in many ways, the deep question is, how do I love my neighbor? And your comments about assimilation are, it's so difficult because on one hand, I love the part of your story where you talked about, coming to California and, well, I'll try a Hispanic church. Well, that's its own culture.
Yeah.
And you went into the Air Force. So when you went into the Air Force, you learned, you had already been familiar with that culture to a degree growing up alongside of it, but now you're more integrated into governmental culture. And then you marry a woman who is not from the same ethnic or cultural background. And so now your children are third culture children. And so part of what churches are continuing to navigate is this attempt to ask this question: how do we embody Christ in, and everyone has a culture. How do we embody Christ in this place, in this place where so many of us are coming from different cultures? The church as institution has a culture. And, I think in many ways the World Renew model is helpful, because when you try to establish some third thing, well, that then will have its own culture. It won't just be CRC. It won't be Assemblies of God. It won't be, some Templo Biblico or something from Mexico. Then you've got the Chinese and the Koreans. And I mean, you're working in one of the most dynamic, culturally exchanging places on the planet. And we're trying to do something which is both ideally transcultural, but always incarnationally embodied within cultures.
Right. Yeah.
That is so hard.
No, I know it's hard, and especially I think what makes it even harder is that we didn't respond, in terms of we Christian Reformed Church have not responded in most places early enough to the changing of our culture, because the church was in a place where the culture sustained the church, the culture in the community sustained the church. But now, because the church culture itself is not sustained by the community, as those folks get older, they're moving away. Their kids are not coming to that church anymore because they're so. That's what makes it even harder. That we don't have the luxury anymore. I would say, in my mind, we don't have the luxury anymore of uh, of keeping the culture that we like. Um, that in some ways we have to make room, space for another culture that is great too, right? That will enrich, and I think that's part of it. It doesn't. People don't believe that if I make room for this other culture, for these other ways of doing things, it will enrich my own community, my own faith. But I think when we have taken those uh, steps and opportunities, for example, with a Korean prayer. Korean prayer is only Korean prayer to the CRC. I told you about the Assembly of God Church in Gravel Ridge, Arkansas. But you go to a lot of these Hispanic churches, and that prayer is been like that. So the worship, the dancing, the clapping, I think in many ways it will enrich. And at the same time, folks coming in to the CRC come not for your worship services, or not for the worship services or for the liturgy, but for how well the theology and scripture align, and how much sense it makes. So they're coming for that reason. They're not staying because there's no room for other things. A lot of churches are making room, but in a lot of churches, it's difficult to make that transition.
And I think part of what, and you mentioned it a moment ago, part of what is difficult in Southern California, I'm watching similar dynamics to what I saw in New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
where you've got, for many of the people of Dutch ancestry in the CRC, Western Michigan is the center of the gravitational universe.
Yep.
That's where the institutions lie.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that these communities are evaporating.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, there's, you could say, well, there's no space, but increasingly there's also there's no the Dutch part of the CRC is not only changing in terms of normal cultural change in an area, but it's also evaporating because the people themselves are leaving and in a sense journeying back home to Western Michigan. And that ecosystem's a completely different animal than New Jersey or California or any of these other places. But no, it's a very live context. I promised I would only take 2 hours of your time, and you have been more than gracious in letting me be nosy and about your story. And I want to thank you so much for being so willing to share. I part of the reason I do these things, Rudy, is because I've worked with you tangentially, but now hearing your story, I know you, or I feel I know you quite a bit better and more deeply. And so now, whenever we work together with something and I watch you, it'll be like, oh, this is this little boy near the Texas border, and then the Air Force officer, and then the engineer at Rockwell, and then the guy who's trying to feed his family, putting in replacement windows, and then because all of that, and then I think all of that, now I understand you better, and when we can understand each other, well, then then beautiful things can happen. So
Yeah.
do you, but I'm saying all this to say, do you have any questions for me? Because I've hogged the conversation for almost 2 hours. And anything that we haven't talked about, or any questions for me before we
Um,
wrap this thing up?
yeah, no, and it doesn't have to be an answer, but I remember earlier on when we talked about racism, you were more comfortable with tribalism. And I'm wondering if there has been any changes in the way you think about racism, maybe some, especially with reading Isabel Wilkerson. How is that from those? I think the last time we had that conversation was probably about a good 7, 8 years ago. I don't know how long it was when I was there with you, but it seemed like you were more comfortable in that zone rather than talking about racism. You were more comfortable talking about tribalism.
I obviously the racism conversation for years I heard people say we need to have a conversation about racism, and now suddenly we're having the conversation and not everybody is happy with it. But that's exactly how conversations go.
Yeah,
And that's actually how the most productive conversations go,
yeah,
because
yeah,
it's and as I'm sure seen quite a bit, that no change happens without pain.
right, right.
And and in terms of hopefully leading people towards productive change, number one, it will be painful. Number two, we never quite know where the end point will be.
That's right.
And obviously in the wake of George Floyd, there's been a lot of conversation about race. My concern for the Christian Reformed Church is that there are elements in a certain corner of the anti-racism conversation that I think are fundamentally postmodern and not Christian. And
Okay.
I've seen some of these elements, and especially language and tells, being taken in and taken on by churches. And I don't think we've done sufficient work to examine some of their credentials.
Yeah,
And
I would agree with you there. But and the weird thing is happening on both sides, right? So you hear like the word intersectionality, right? So then you get a evangelical folks saying, "Hey, wait, we don't want intersectionality," but it has so much more meaning than what they've attached to it. On the other hand, you talk to this side, and then they do the same thing. But I guess what I'm interested in is how do we keep the conversation moving without avoiding the labels that we put on each other. Because when talking about critical race theory, for example, they have this. They're those folks. So then those folks then say these guys are the white evangelicals. They're those folks, right? But that's not going to help anybody. But if we really talk about how do we not dismiss, I guess, and center in on this conversation about racism, it might be difficult, but if we can avoid the labeling, I'm thinking, and even if we don't use like a label, but in our conversations we label by putting folks in camps. I think that's the difficult part.
yeah, and I agree with you 100%. And I want us within the Christian Reformed Church, and obviously I'm having conversations outside the Christian Reformed Church.
Yeah.
I sort of came to this first with the LGBT discussions in the CRC.
Yeah.
because the overall, the CRC came to a truce over women in office, which was the big fight from the 70s to the aughts.
Yeah.
And the CRC arrived at a political truce that I think took some things off of Synod's docket. But when I go back to Synod now 20 years later, and again, partly because on the CRC landscape, I've been a reliable person on one particular side.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my church is multicultural. I grew up in a landmark CRC race relations congregation. My mother was an elder before women elders were allowed. So I very easily fit on that one side of the CRC. But when I go to Synod now, and just on the women in office side, I hear the complementarians over here saying, you know, this isn't our home. And I hear the women pastors saying, I'm not accepted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I say, we need to keep talking.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to keep talking.
Yep.
And then I saw the whole same-sex marriage thing, and that's continuing to emerge. And the CRC is not going to dodge this. And my desire is we need to keep talking. And
Yeah.
the Belhar, I saw the Belhar, and I saw, okay, we're going to add a fourth confession. And I thought, one of the tribes of the CRC are the confessionalists. What the confessionalists have been saying for 50 years is, we have these confessions we need to take seriously. And the evangelical faction and the mainline faction, you're not taking these confessions seriously. And then suddenly a group sort of from the mainline faction of the CRC comes in and says, we want a new confession. And the confessionalists are like, oh, now you want to talk confessions. And I watched how the denomination attempted to manage that conversation. And I thought, have you never met a human being? Do you not know how tribes work? Do you not understand how when you're asking people to be open to something new, it's going to take a while. You're going to have to be sensitive. And like you said, labeling someone else is not going to probably be a helpful part of the process. Let's label ideas and words.
That's right. That's right.
But let's hold off on labeling people, because here's the thing. Yeah, go ahead.
No, but even like words, like for example, you know, that's why I gave you that word, because sometimes people take ownership of a word, and it's not their word to take ownership of. It's being defined differently than some other people are defining it. So
That's right.
Why take ownership of that if it's not your word? And right now, especially, I just see terms and definitions being re-examined, redefined. So yeah. Anyway, what I would like is that we don't dismiss the work of racism, anti-racism, because it is harmful to the church, to the community.
Racism is.
Yeah, racism. Yeah. It's harmful. It pits you and me. I mean, here we are having this great conversation, right? But if I didn't know you, because of racism, I would have thoughts about you that are not true. You would have thoughts about me that are not true, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Which is exactly why when I do these videos, I do them exactly how I do them. Some people are like, Paul, why do you spend so much time talking about someone's story? It's because Rudy Gonzalez has an incredible story that has, how many different racial layers, church layers, theological layers, technical layers, familial layers, and all of these layers come into our conversations, usually unseen. And now we often don't have the time to have the kind of conversation we have now.
Right.
But I want people to not deal with cardboard cutouts of each other and yell at one another.
Right.
Sit down, because I mean the what's at the top of the what's the radical, what's What's the radical thing that Jesus Christ calls his followers into? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that neighbor includes and goes all the way up to and includes your enemy.
That's right.
And
That's
so
right.
the challenge of Christianity is to love your enemy.
Right.
And that enemy might be someone who beat you up because you were a certain color or a certain gender. And I loved how you said it. There's things on both sides of the fence that have to happen. You look across the fence and you say, boy, I bet they're going to treat me a certain way because these are these aspects of my individual that are different from them. And it might be race, it might be gender, might be the school you went to, might be the state you grew up in, might even be the sports teams you like. Probably right now the political party, because, you know, in a recent study in America, people are quicker to have their child come home with a fiance of a different race than the other political party. That's a real problem.
Although Paul, I would say that more than likely, if that's the case, it's going to be an interracial couple if that happens, because at least what I read is the conservative black people, conservative white people, they agree on the issues, but they don't agree on the political parties.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a big difference.
That's true. And this is why, you know, when people see, and so here I'm a white CRC guy. Everyone expects me to be a Republican. No, but I grew up in Patterson. And so I tell you, I usually vote with the black folks. People are like, why would you vote with the black folks? And why do the black folks vote that way? Well, you're not going to have to talk to them about that, because there are reasons the black folks, and people say, well, the Republicans are the party of Lincoln. I say, well, fair enough, but a lot happened since Lincoln. But these are all moving issues. And so, no, Rudy, I am, what I have wanted for the CRC all along, the core of what I want are better conversations.
Amen. Amen. I agree with that. And I'm learning how to do that, because growing up in South Texas, I was not taught that. There's a reason why they say that there's a what do they call it? The Texan dark streak or something like that, dark sense of humor. It's Texan style is always to most Texans always joke around. They call it joking, jabbing, but it's usually a put down. And that's part of the culture. It's just like, anyway, I got a sidetrack, but I do want to have those conversations. And we're really, in race relations, we're trying to figure out how do we tell both sides of the story, and not just assume that there is a story, and then create a shared story, especially in the church. Because if we can do it in the church, I think we have the gift of being able to gather people, convene people, have people come from different points of views, come together and be together. And through that, if we can figure out how do we tell our stories and then be able to share a story, won't be easy, but I think that's what we're trying to do.
And we'd like to see the group find that story together.
Yes, we're not going to come up with it. Yeah,
right.
we're wanting the group to do that.
Yeah.
One of the things, I'm just going to put in a little plug here. One of the things that we're going to try to do is we're going to try to do a national, we're going to try to pilot this year a group that is called an active bystander group that would then create little chapters. So we're hoping to do that this year.
Okay.
If not this year, early next year. But
all right. So Rudy, if people want to find you, how can they find you?
I'm on the CRCNA Race Relations website.
Okay.
So I don't know if you can put a link for that.
Yeah, I could put a link to it.
Yeah,
I'll do that.
Good. So you can find me there. There, you can also have my telephone number. It's right on the site there.
Okay. We won't mention it now, but I'll put a link to the site and they can find it if they want to follow up with you.
Yeah, if they want to follow up with me, that would be good. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook. So all those places. They look me up. They can find me that way. But I do appreciate very much this, Paul, and great conversation.
I've loved it, Rudy. I've loved it. So, I will post this tomorrow. And
good.
again, thank you so much for your time and for coming on my channel and for telling your story.
Thank you.
It's a, here's the thing. I love hearing people's stories,
I
and
can tell. Yeah.
and you tell it well. And so God bless you as you continue your work, and
Yes.
God bless the little church in Moreno Valley.
Yes.
COVID is going to change the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And Christians who are about prayer should be praying about this.
Yeah.
But I think Christianity is an optimistic religion where we follow a resurrected Christ, and we
Hallelujah.
believe in the life of the age to come.
Amen.
And while we struggle now, we're heading in a good direction, and Jesus will get us there. So
Sounds like you're a preacher.
I am a preacher.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Thank you, Rudy. Thank you
Thank
so
you, Paul.
much.
Blessings to you.
Blessings to you
Bye.
too. Bye-bye.